For the rest of this section, what we're going to be looking at are the different types of observational studies. So here we have the types of observational studies that are possible. Now there can be combinations of these, so a study doesn't have to be all one or another. There can be variations of these, but these are the main three types of observational studies. We will talk about designed experiments in section 1.6. The different types of designed experiments will be discussed there. So cross-sectional studies, those are observational studies that collect information about individuals at a specific point in time or over a very short period of time. To be totally honest, my opinion is that most observational studies are usually cross-sectional studies. So you can think of them as like a snapshot. It's like at this point in time, here's what's true. So political polls are generally cross-sectional studies. They take a sample of individuals on a particular day or maybe a couple of days time periods, very short period of time. They contact individuals. They ask, whatever the political question is, do you approve of the president's performance? Do you not approve of the president's performance? Or some kind of political question. Those are, again, generally cross-sectional studies because they obtain data over a short period of time. They're not supposed to influence the results of the study, so it's an observational study, and you just get that snapshot of what's true at that point in time. Now, it doesn't have to be political. There could be other kinds of cross-sectional studies as well, but usually they're more like sociological in nature. So you're obtaining information over a short period of time. Now, a case control study, on the other hand, these are a little more involved. A case control study is called a retrospective study. They're retrospective, meaning that they require individuals to look back in time or require the researcher to look at existing records. In a case control study, individuals who have certain characteristics are matched with those that do not. So basically, the way I think of a case control study compared to a cross-sectional study is that in a case control study, you probably have a set of individuals who have some common characteristic, like maybe they have brain tumor. And so you look at this group of individuals who have this common characteristic, and you try to look back retrospectively at their life to maybe try to figure out why. Why do they have the brain tumor? What variables might affect whether or not there's a brain tumor? So the things that you might look at would be like family history, heredity, did the individual smoke, what kind of diet did they have over their lifetime, and so on. And so again, it's retrospective because data wasn't being measured as they lived specifically, but the individual is sort of reporting on what was true during the time that they were developing the brain tumor or whatever it is that we're talking about. So again, it's different from a cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study is, what do you think today? What's true today? If you had to vote today, who would you vote for? That's a cross-sectional study. Case control, we're in this spot. How did we get there? So let's look back and try to figure out, what the variables were that maybe resulted in the place that we are now. A cohort study, on the other hand, first identifies a group of individuals to participate in the study, the cohort. The cohort is then observed over a long period of time. Over this time period, characteristics about the individuals are recorded. Cohort studies are prospective as opposed to retrospective. Now, what does that mean? So suppose we're interested in studying something like heart disease. And so in a cohort study, what we would do, again, we can't really do an experiment because we don't want to manipulate individuals in a way that results in some people ending up with heart disease, right? So it's got to be an observational study. So in a cohort study, what would happen is we would take a group of individuals, the cohort, and we would just follow them over a long period of time, keeping track of vital information that might relate to heart disease. So again, things like family history, diet, and so on as we go through time. And then, maybe over a period of 10 or 20 years, there's going to be some of those individuals who develop heart disease, and some of the individuals won't develop heart disease. Well, what's happened then, if we're doing this cohort study, we have tracked these individuals over a long period of time so that we have very accurately measured data on these individuals. And so for the individuals who end up with heart disease, we have this accurate data that we can follow to try to maybe determine what was the cause of the heart disease, for example. Again, you can't really prove cause and effect with an observational study, but we can find an association that would, we might advise individuals to stray away from whatever is associated with the heart disease, even though it's not absolutely proven to be a cause. So again, a cross-sectional study is like a snapshot. So you gather data over a very brief amount of time, a day or a few days, in order to answer the questions for your research. A case control study, you have individuals with some characteristic that you're interested in studying, and you either look back at actual recorded data that happened to exist over time, or you ask the individuals to answer questions about the variables over time. Again, that is retrospective, so they're thinking back, or you're obtaining data from a source that just happens to exist, rather than setting it up yourself. Again, the point would generally be to try to figure out what's associated with the characteristic that you're studying. And in a case control study, you have a bunch of individuals who don't have a common characteristic. You're just gathering data on them so that at some point when there is a common characteristic among some of that cohort, you have accurately recorded data that you're trying to use as a way to look for associations. Cross-sectionals are the most common. They're the least expensive of the observational studies. Case control was probably the second most common. And then cohorts are probably the least common. The downside of cohort studies is that they're very, very expensive. There have been some cohort studies that's been going on for generations of people, tracking things like heart disease, for example, so that there's very accurate data to try to give evidence as to why some individuals develop heart disease and others don't. But the trouble with that is they're expensive, they're time consuming, and so usually an individual researcher can't do a cohort study. It requires an institution or an organization such as the American Heart Association or the Red Cross or something like that in order to be able to fund a cohort study. Additional data sources. So we've talked about observational studies, we've talked about designed experiments, and we've talked about specific types of observational studies. Well, additional data sources, we can get data from a census. So what's a census? A census is basically a situation where we get information from every individual in the population. So we have to have a census in order to calculate a true parameter, as opposed to a sample that's going to calculate a statistic. So a census is a list of all individuals in a population along with certain characteristics of each individual. Truly, a census would be the best way to obtain information that we're wanting for our research. The trouble is, censuses are not practical. We have the United States Census every 10 years. And there's always challenges every time the United States does a census because it's very difficult to get in contact with every individual in the population. There's always issues that come up, things like homelessness, so it's hard to get track of people who are homeless. And then there's always issues like, citizens who live abroad are often difficult to get a hold of, other issues like mobility, and so on and so on and so on. So a census is actually very, very difficult, very challenging to truly conduct. But the truth is that depends on the size of the population. If you have a relatively small population, let's say we're talking about Lewis and Clark students as my population, well then a census is not going to be nearly as challenging as if I'm talking about like US citizens, for example. But anyway, we can get data from a census. Other ways of getting data, web scraping or data mining, is the process of extracting data from the internet. So extracting data from tables on the web and then upload the data to a file. So in other words, we can use existing data that comes from other sources. Fetching unstructured information and putting it in a structured format, becoming an important part of data science industry. And there are now ethical issues about this because oftentimes the individual obtaining the data hasn't sought out the permission of the individual who is hosting that data. Data that's made public, government agencies, companies, sports organizations are nowadays regularly making their data available to the public. And so you could often download databases of data from their websites. Now, the trouble with using someone else's data is you're not necessarily assured of the accuracy of that as opposed to obtaining it yourself. But generally, if we're talking about an organization like the government or a company or a sports organization, their data is generally going to be somewhat reliable.